Shabbat Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Behar, at the mountain, and it begins with a series of instructions that are given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. I'd like to focus on a series of commandments that have to do with the sabbatical year and with the Jubilee. We start with the instruction regarding the sabbatical year, and we read as follows in verse 3, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in the increase thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of strict rest to the land, a Sabbath for the eternal. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. And we see here, therefore, that the cycle of the sabbatical years in the agriculture is set up using the language of Sabbath and set up very similar to the 7 days of creation followed by the 6 days of creation followed by the 7th day, which is a Sabbath. It reminds us very much about the way this is set up. The original Sabbath is set up in Genesis. Here we have 6 years of work followed by a 7th year where we rest, where we let the land rest, and this is actually called a Sabbath. In Genesis, we have 6 days where God created the world, and on the 7th day he rested, followed by a commandment to humanity, 6 days. We will work and create and be productive, and on the 7th day we rest. Why? Because God rested on the 7th day. The Scripture then carries on and talks about the Jubilee. And again, in a very similar vein, we have the following verse, verse 8, and you shall number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you, 7 times 7 years. And the period of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the cornet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, and the day of expiation shall you make the cornet pass through all your land, and you shall sanctify the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Here we have another cycle, also based on 7, but instead of 7 days of creation, or the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle, we have 7 cycles of 7 years. And then on the 50th year, we have almost like a super Sabbath, and this is the Jubilee. What happens in the 50th year? Here, all land transactions that had taken place before, people had sold their land to other people, and the 50th year, the land goes back to its original owner, and at the same time, there's no harvesting or working the land that takes place during that year. What we see, therefore, is a series of cycles, beginning with the 7 days of creation. We then have the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle. Then we have the 7 sets of 7 years that leads us to the Jubilee. There is one more set of 7 that we actually read about in last week's Torah portion, and that is the counting of the 50 days between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot. And we see this in chapter 23, verse 15. And you shall count to you from the morrow after the day of rest, from the day that you've brought the omer of the wave offering, 7 weeks shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th week shall you number 50 days, and you shall offer a new oblation unto the Eternal. This is a counting of 7 weeks that begins on the 2nd day of Passover and ends on the holiday of the first fruits, which is also the holiday of Shavuot. This is later, and the holiday of Shavuot is actually connected not only with this particular harvest offering, this first fruits offering, but it is connected with the giving of the Torah. The revelation at Sinai took place exactly 50 days after the Exodus from Egypt. And therefore, the way we celebrate these holidays, we count between Passover and Shavuot. It is a counting, Shavuot is Pentecost, it is a counting that we are involved in right now. And it is not just accounting that is related to agriculture, but has been connected because of the nature of the holiday of Passover, the freedom from Egypt, counting towards the revelation at Sinai. What actually links these two events, on Passover we celebrate a physical freedom. God physically took us out of slavery. We are no longer enslaved to the rulers of Egypt. We are now free. It is a physical emancipation. We count 7 weeks, and on the seventh week, at the culmination of the 7th week, on the 50th day, we received the Torah. We received revelation from God. At that point, we achieve a spiritual emancipation, because it is when we become servants of God, when we accept the Torah, when we become totally connected to God in a very important national way, in a spiritual way, is this process complete. And I think this actually is what we see in this 7-day, the uses of 7 days at every point. It is always a connection between the physical and the spiritual. We work for 6 days, we rest on the 7th. And the 7th day of rest is not just a question of abstention from work, but it is a holy day. It is a day of the spiritual as opposed to the physical. Same thing with the agricultural cycles, the sabbatical cycle and the Jubilee. We rest the land. We rest ourselves from working the land. We have a cycle that is 6, that is physical labor, and on the 7th we have a release from that physical labor. But it is also involved in a sanctification and a holiness, and we see this particularly in the description of the Jubilee year, because what we have then is as follows. We have verse 23 in our portion today. We have the following: the land shall not be sold absolutely, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the land of your possession you shall grant a redemption for the land. First of all, the use of the word redemption here is very interesting, because we're used to associating the word redemption with a physical, with a spiritual, or a spiritual and national sort of redemption. And here we're talking about a redemption that applies to the land itself. But on the other hand, what we have here embodied in these verses is the relationship of God with the land. The fact that the Jubilee year, the land goes back to its original owner. The reason for that is God is telling us the land really doesn't belong to us to begin with, because the land belongs to God. Therefore, in that 50th year, we are releasing the land from its physical work, but we are also releasing the land from its physical ownership that has been built into the land for all these years. And it is on this year and through the commandments involving the 50th year that we remember it is actually God's land. And I think this connects us very, very well with the concept of the 7 days of creation. The first place that we see this cycle of 7. It is not just a physical and a spiritual. When God rested on the 7th day, God marked the completion of creation. There is no greater expression of God's ownership of the world than his resting on the 7th day. And in our resting on the 7th day, we recognize God's ownership of the world, God's control of the world, and indeed when we step back and rest ourselves, we are acknowledging that God commands us and that God rules this world, and therefore we are able to step back from the physical laws of nature for 1 day every week, for 1 year every 7 years, because we know that it is God who is ultimately in charge. And this is the theme that we see here. And how is that connected to the land? Because the land itself, as physical as it must be, and here we are talking about the land of Israel. The land of Israel, as physically as it is the place where God's ownership and the Jewish people come together. God not only created the world, but he created this land. And even as he gave the land to the Jewish people, God retains his ownership of the land. And in sitting back and becoming free of our physical obligations in that 7th year, we acknowledge God's ownership of the land of Israel. And all of this brings home to us the need for us to honor God, to honor the Sabbath, to honor his will, and to honor his division of the land, for it is his land. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.